We are live.
Good evening, and thank you for tuning into this broadcast with Global Exchange, Peninsula 360 Press, and that will also be live streamed on Rompeviento television in Spanish. Si estás escuchando en español, favor de poner clic al globo abajo de la pantalla para luego escuchar la interpretación. Gracias. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Brazil, and in just an hour, Brazil is going to be talking to itself about its elections. There's a debate scheduled in exactly an hour from now. This hour, we're going to have the chance to dig into what's happening in Brazil just on the eve of this Sunday's first round of Brazil's presidential election. And we've got some great folks with us. Before we start, I just want to emphasize why it's so important that we're in Brazil tonight doing this work, or some of us are. And the fact is, Brazil is a gigantic country. It is 8.5 million square kilometers. It's by far the largest country in Latin America. It is larger than the continental United States. It has 214 million people, 156 million voters. It's the fifth largest country in the world by area and the seventh most populous. And as we're talking about politics tonight, it's a vast federation composed of 26 states and a federal district. It's the largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world and one of the most multicultural and ethnically diverse nations in the world, as well as the world's most populous Roman Catholic country. To talk about the elections that are upcoming, we have a great panel that include Fernando Cruz, a Brazilian journalist based in Brasilia. He has 27 years of professional experience. He also worked for the first Lula administration as an international press officer. He has also worked with the United Nations as a communications officer, and currently he's the editor of the Workers' Party website and is a contributor to Global Exchange and Peninsula 360 Press in these elections. Fernando, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We're going to look to you later to talk to us about electronic voting and President Bolsonaro's sustained attack on Brazil's own electoral system and what we should expect on election day. We're also honored to have with us Beatriz Megaloni. She's a professor in international relations in the Department of Political Science. She's a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and director of the Poverty, Violence, and Government Lab at Stanford University in California. She works on authoritarian and democratic politics, violence, and human rights abuses. She's worked in Rio de Janeiro investigating police violence and the expansion of militias. Her published works, including her paper on killing in the slums, social order, criminal governance, and police violence in Rio de Janeiro, and her book, Voting for Autocracy, have won important prizes, including the 2021 Heinz Elau Award for the best article published in American Political Science and the Leon D. Epstein Outstanding Book Award. Thank you so much, Beatriz, for being with us. We're going to be looking to you to talk about violence in Brazil in the times of Bolsonaro and before, repression against minorities, and what possibilities you see of violence if the election doesn't come out the way that some of the contenders hope it will. We also are happy to have with us Anneli Muraz, a socialist and feminist writer. She's both the CEO and a writer for Peninsula 360 Press, a cross-cultural social research and communication studio. She's the profit manager at the nonprofit Casa Círculo Cultural in Redwood City, where she runs the Women's Social Lab, a collaborative of supporting workspace that benefits local young girls and women from underserved communities. She is the co-editor and author of a book, Sociology with Audiovisual Media, and we're very happy to have her tonight. Anneli, you were on a first prior mission with Peninsula 360 Press and Global Exchange, and we're looking forward to hearing from you about what you did and what the project that Global Exchange and Peninsula 360 has in store over the next month. Michael Fox is a freelance multimedia journalist based in Latin America. He's a former editor of the NOCLA Report on the Americas. and he's the host of a new podcast on Brazil, Brazil on Fire, which looks at Brazil's slide toward fascism under current President Jair Bolsonaro. He's a contributor to Global Exchange and Peninsula 360 Press during this electoral period. He's also a longtime colleague of mine, a good friend, and an exemplary human being. He's going to talk to us about the history of fascism in Brazil, its links to the Bolsonaro government. But Mike, we'd like to turn to you first tonight and ask you to start us off in broad strokes. What's going on? Why is this an important election? How does it matter to people in the United States? And please take it from there.
Excellent. Well, what we're looking at in a lot of ways, and the way I like to talk about this in the podcast, are these two different visions for what Brazil can be or should be. One, of course, is former President Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva. This is an election that we're having just in a couple of days. He, in very many ways, he kind of represents democracy, right? That he's a Democrat. That's where he comes from. He's a former union leader who rose to the presidency in 2002. He was there for 2 terms, lifted millions of people out of poverty. And then the other vision that we have for the country is dictatorship. And this is current President Jair Bolsonaro. He came to power in 2018 on the backs of the jailing of former President Lula in trumped up charges that sent him to jail for 580 days and blocked him from running in that election, which really opened the doors for Bolsonaro. And he rose to power using kind of this culture war facade, right, of really doubling down on attacking the LGBT community, on lifting kind of a strong-armed, militaristic, and also harkening back to the dictatorship. And again, this was happening at the same time as the entire country was being gutted by that same car wash investigation, which sent Lula to jail, sent 280 convicted 280 different top politicians in Brazil, and that really turned Brazilian politics on their head. And again, this also happened after the impeachment, the parliamentary coup, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, which happened in 2016, which was a push to try and take the Workers' Party, take the left from power. So from this, Bolsonaro rises to power in 2018, and his rhetoric really unleashed just a wave of violence ahead of that election. And unleash kind of these fascist, neo-fascist forces. What we saw just in the first couple of years of Bolsonaro's government is the increase of neo-Nazi cells rose by roughly 60%. Bolsonaro gutted state institutions that were there to protect the Amazon, there to protect the environment, there to protect indigenous rights, and kind of unleash this wave of violence all across the Amazon region with invasions into indigenous territories and whatnot. And that's just on the Amazon. He also gutted the labor ministry, gutted all these other ministries, and actually placed into the Ministry of Women, Human Rights, and then created the Ministry of Family as well, and placed at its head a former evangelical pastor to really kind of gut what was human rights policies that Brazil had for years and for decades, and to transform this into a focus much more on family values, on the moral agenda, and that's been extremely key for Bolsonaro. So that's what we've seen over these last few years, is kind of the gutting of state institutions, at the same time as, I mean, we could talk for hours about COVID-19, right? The Bolsonaro's handling of COVID-19 that would then lead to 700,000 deaths across the country, when a Senate investigation hearing they had just about a year and a half ago, and they accused Bolsonaro of 9 different crimes for his failed handling of the pandemic, for pushing unproven drugs, and for just completely ignoring and turning his back on indigenous communities. And so in so many ways, his government has attempted to gut the Brazilian social state. And he's also attacked the Supreme Court, attacked Congress, and he's used this kind of rhetoric attacking these other branches of government in order to try and bolster his support and really shore up those supporters in very much the same way that we saw from Donald Trump, right, in the United States. So you have to kind of see this within the context of the U.S. connection to this, within Trump and all this. And this is kind of where we stand right now, kind of at this crossroads. Is Bolsonaro going to be able to push the country more in a direction of authoritarianism, of dictatorship? Is he going to win? Or is Lula going to take power? At this moment right now, Lula is 17 points ahead of Bolsonaro in the polls. That is extremely positive. He may take it in the first round, but then what does that what happens? What does Bolsonaro do if he loses the election? And is he going to try to attempt another January 6th style coup, but for Brazil?
Right, and Mike, thank you very much for that. And the fact that Lula leads Bolsonaro by 17 points is astounding, really. But we know also that Donald Trump has been endorsing people all over the United States for our own elections, which are coming up in November, and that he actually decided to intervene in the Brazilian context as well. Seemed very pleased with Bolsonaro having the nickname the Tropical Trump. So I think that's a theme that we want to follow up on. So thank you very much for that, and we'll be coming back around. Annalee, you were part of a first mission that Peninsula 360 and Global Exchange organized to Brazil, and you can you tell us what the plan is, that how our Global Exchange and Peninsula 360 Press and our allies, what are we doing to cover the elections in Brazil this weekend and this upcoming month?
Yes, hi, thank you everybody. Our Global Exchange and Peninsula 360 this coverage started about a month ago, and we have the ground we have covered. We're covering as we go. I'm going to share a little presentation. Is thought to get some. We have focused on visibilizing what we call candidacies of contestation, or candidaturas de contestatarias. These candidacies are for Black, Indigenous, women of color, people who identify with LGBTQI communities. And we have covered these candidacies and these visibilized communities in general in Rio, in Brasilia, in Sao Paulo, and we will also cover in the coming days the Amazon. We are right now, our colleagues, Manuel Ortiz, Juliana Monteiro, and Alex Sierra from Colombia are in Salvador, Bahia, as we're talking, and they are covering, they went to Salvador to cover the Afro-Brazilian region, because, well, if you don't know, there are more than 80% of people who identify as Black in Salvador. So global support really makes the coverage possible through the Sistema Pública de Radiodifusión del Estado Mexicano, which is the Mexican state of broadcasting system, and Rompeviento TV, Pie de Página, as well as media in Colombia, and Ethnic Media Services, which is a network of over 2,000 ethnic media in the US, and radio as well. We have radio in one of our key points, or one of our other areas that we are trying to cover, or we're covering, is the data analysis. We have someone going through internet and really going through just how the social media flows are working throughout this electoral process. We're about to interview Paulo Fonseca Freitas, who in Salvador, Bahia, who also is an expert in this data. I want to point this out because it has been very important to link this with hashtags that are actually in some way linked to Trumpism, like Michael was saying, or even you were stating, Ted. I do want to point out that one of the things we have noticed that is like a link throughout whatever we've covered during this time is there is a fear. We did encounter journalists who are afraid to speak out. We've had the same issue with academics. And I do want to point this out because they're coming from this era of that has really where aggressions and violence has grown, and I'm sure Beatriz will talk more about that. I just wanted to know that we have also covered this, and one of the things that we covered about this as well is women. We spoke to women in Brasilia who are pro Bolsonaro, who really have justified everything that that he did during these past years as president. And in a way, we call this a process of contestation because now we are seeing all these candidacies and people who are really trying to push back in these elections. And this, for example, is she's a transgender woman, Sol de Maria. She's a waiter, and she moved to Salvador because she felt safer there. Ana Paula Rosario she's campaigning as we speak for Vilma Reis for Diputada Federal. And we have everything you can find in our social media and our websites. Like this is one of the articles that just came out, Candidaturas Contestatarias en Resistencia, and where Barbara Pelacani and Chico Brum, photographers in Rio, and went to photograph these candidates. So please follow our social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and we will be posting everything as this unfolds in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana. That's really great. And there will be so much to follow, and we're going to stay with this this issue. We want to turn now to Fernando Cruz. Fernando, you're in the, Ana, can you take this? Yeah, thank you. Fernando, you're in the Capitol. Can you help us? We're outsiders, but we really want you to drill down for us and explain what's happening. What are the possible outcomes? What are the scenarios in the possible first round, second round? What are the composition of the other parties that might affect the outcome in a second round? Just talk to us about that so we can really get a better understanding. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone. Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure. Well, as the latest polls indicate, the scenario is very stable, regarding the voting intentions here in Brazil. So I think that helps rising tensions because it's everyone is like kind of asking, is it possible to get this done right there, right there on Sunday, or do we have to wait? I think there's no question, if there is no fraud, Lula is going to win this election. The big question we should be asking ourselves is, what Bolsonaro is going to do about that, because now we have the whole world watching us, watching Brazil, everybody's talking about that. We had this week, a big increase in news about Brazil, talking about the elections in Brazil all over the world. We've been following the most of the papers, the newspapers, from the more independent ones to the big ones like the Washington Post, the Guardian, the New York Times, and so on. So everybody's watching it. So this is the question. I think because if we look back at 4 years ago, we had Bolsonaro ahead, in the polls for like a long time, when Lula was put in prison, when he was committed to jail. So Bolsonaro now, he lies about that, because he says, oh, the polls got it wrong 4 years ago, but that wasn't true. The polls got it right. And now they, like you said, Lula is like 10 to 12 to 15 to 14 points ahead of him. So he's been rising, casting doubts about the electronic system. So I took some notes here so I don't get confused. I'm sorry, it's been a long time since I speak. Last time I spoke English. I've been speaking Portuguese every day. So
you're doing an awesome job. Keep going.
Thank you. So about the electronic system, I think it's very important to point out that the Brazilian system, it's not something new. It's a tool that was implemented more than 25 years ago in this country. It has been tested and perfected through several elections, dozens of them, in fact, for mayor, government, the Congress, you name it, and the president. So the technology has been developed precisely to prevent election fraud, something that for sure that has happened in our history through the decades since the empire. So that's what the Electoral Supreme Court says. Since 2010, we had our first public test back then. It's been 12 years. So since then, each election, the system, they improved the system. The Superior Electoral Court makes several public tests to make sure the electronic system is reliable. So from back to 1996, when we first started this system, the first model was used back then. From that time to now, we've never had a case of fraud. You can look for the newspapers, for the past 26 years, even a slight suspicion of something like that. Unlike the old manual system, when people like transporting those ballot boxes, those little pieces of paper, sometimes those papers got lost, the boxes got lost, or some non-existent vote was added to help some cheater winning the election. That was in the past, a long time ago. Another important thing to say here is that it's very hard to change the machine's source code simply because they're not connected to the internet. All the data is sent through an internal system which can shut down if something is detected. So the risk of somebody physically, somebody hacking the system, it's very, very, very difficult. And that makes Bolsonaro's claims that the system is not reliable. And that those claims sound a little bit crazy, as we know, because Bolsonaro himself, he has been elected through the system several times over the last 2.5 decades. So we're talking about 25 years here. So yesterday, the chief of the Electoral Superior Court, Alexandre de Moraes, opened the main vote counting room, to all kinds of international observers and inspectors, including the military and the people from the parties, representatives from the parties. And he almost joked saying that there is no secret or dark room, like Bolsonaro was implying, making a reference to his comment, to his suspicions about the possibility of fraud. So as Bolsonaro is facing a real and strong and massive defeat next Sunday, or maybe in 3 weeks, like I said, maybe a month, at the end of the month, if we have the second round, he's getting desperate. And now, because the system is very fast, results now from millions of voters, are presented about 2 hours after the polls close. He will try to use that against the Supreme Court and the Electoral Court. One of his strategies was this document that was released by his party, PL, which is called the Liberal Party, yesterday. And the document is casting doubts about the integrity of the system using allegedly, technical arguments. So the court responded really fast, saying that the content of this document is just a bunch of lies with no base on reality. So Moraes asked to include PL's press release, this document that was curiously
I'm sorry, Fernando. Who was it? The court rejected this document? Can you explain that just a little bit more?
Well, the court didn't reject it. The party released this document unsigned, which is very strange. But everybody knows it was the party who released the document, and the document is casting doubts about the system. So the guy Alexandre de Moraes, who's the chief of the Electoral Court, he put out a press release saying that the content of this document was basically a bunch of lies with no base on reality. So he asked to include this document into the fake news inquiry, which is an investigation that is going on for some time now into the attacks and threats against judges from the Supreme Court and against democracy. So I think in the end, this last move, this last strategy by Bolsonaro could be very dangerous. It could backfire. It could be something that would hurt him really badly, because on Sunday, like I said, everyone will be looking at Brazil. So I don't think he has a lot of support in the military right now. So we've been seeing through the last days, a lot of people, a lot of supporters, saying, maybe this is not the case, that we should support this guy anymore.
So that was going to be my next question, because the fear for a lot of people, I'm sure in Brazil, but internationally, has been remembering the history of military rule in Brazil, and thinking that Bolsonaro could be reaching out to his friends within the command structures. What is your opinion about that? It sounds like you don't think that's currently a real threat.
I think he's I think he's not going to accept easily the results. He's not going to give up and say, "Oh, okay, I lost. So, here's to you, Lula. Let's be friends." He's not going to do that. We know that. So he's going to say it was a fraud. He's going to say the elections weren't real. And from that on, he's going to try to escalate. But I think that's my perception. I think in the end, he might end up with just another, riots like the one that happened in the United States. I hope we don't get anyone killed. But I don't think he will be able to start a new military dictatorship in Brazil. I don't think he has that kind of support.
He's going to be limited, like Trump is in the United States, to,
I think so,
having a mobilized fascist. I mean, we've never had anything mobilized in the United States like what we're seeing now. So even though Trump lost, we still feel like, the country's lost, and that there's a really dangerous movement that has been unleashed because of
definitely.
Trump's actions.
Definitely, because Bolsonarismo, as we say in Brazil, you know, his supporters, they're not going to vanish. You know, if they lose, they're not going to just, you know, say, okay, well, let's move on with our lives. I think eventually that will happen, but it's going to take some time. In between the victory and those, you know, peaceful days that we've been dreaming of, I think he's going to try something. My point is, I don't think he has the strength to do that. And if he does, I don't think he's going to last. You know, I don't think Brazil has any. There's no way, you know, in this day and age, you know, in the 21st century, that we're going to have like Bolsonaro dreams, you know, a dictatorship, and we're gonna shut everyone, you know. With, you know, everybody's has internet connection now, so that's very hard to control.
We can't see a 1964 kind of scenario coming out of this. That's fabulous. I'm so relieved to hear that from you, Fernando, and Beatriz. We'll get right to you in just a second. But I wanted to ask you, Fernando, one more question, which was you know, pointed to this remarkable rebound comeback by Lula, and you mentioned one factor that he was released from jail, but are there other elements of that comeback that you could you know, analyze for us? Are there other factors at work?
Well, I think Lula is first of all, I think he's, you know, because you have to understand that the press in Brazil, you know, the media, that what we used to call the social official media in Brazil. That includes social media and also the big companies who run the press in Brazil. They've been attacking Lula since he took office, to be honest, almost 20 years ago. So I think it's amazing how he, you know, he manages to get so many punches through the years, and apparently people didn't forget him, you know, because we have to remember that 4 years ago he was in jail and he was still leading the polls. You know, he was leading the polls. So I think Bolsonaro really was a big helper, because his government was his administration was such a disaster in so many levels, and then we have to talk about, you know, poverty and hunger. You know, we eliminated hunger in Brazil like 8 years ago, and now we're back. You know, we've got unemployment rates, and I think that really helped Lula, because he already showed that he, of course, he's not perfect. I'm not saying that, wow, he has the best, but he showed Brazil and the world that we can have a little bit of a better world, you know, a little bit of justice, social justice, you know. We could bring some peace and some opportunities to people in this country. So I think people didn't forget that. And that's why he's been leading polls, you know. And also, I think between women, I think his government, they did imply a lot of actions and policies to help women in Brazil. And also, I think they remembered that.
People remember the good times.
And Bolsonaro, on the other hand, he's been attacking women, minorities, you know, indigenous and you know, black people. He's been acting against all the people that Lula tried to represent, you know, in a way. So I think that made Lula's way easier, you know, through these elections. I don't think he had to work really hard. He just had to say, hey, I'm the guy who did this. I'm the guy who did that. You know, you got the papers here, you know, to prove it to you. So just take the papers from back then and you see. So I think that's
very interesting. Well, thank you, Fernando. And we'll come back around. Beatriz, you've been working on issues that, you know, affect some of the poorest people in Brazil, and really at at a deep level. You've looked into these matters. Please tell us, what you are focused on there, particularly, what might change or evolve depending on how this election goes.
Yes, thank you for having me. So I want to.
Oh, dear Beatriz, we're having some.
Begin by giving a little bit of background, thinking about the behavior of police. Can you hear me now? No?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Now we can hear you. You're coming through loud and clear.
Something happened with my microphone. So
okay.
I hope there is not an echo.
No, it's all good now. It's perfect now.
So there is various forms of violence in Brazil that Bolsonaro has ignited, and has there has been a significant increase in violence in general during his administration. We have to remember that when he campaigned, he embraced fully the phrase "bandido bom, bandido morto," which means a good criminal is a dead criminal. And with that, he was giving full permission to police forces to behave in an incredibly violent way. So in some states in Brazil, police kill, if you count homicides, police count 20% of the homicides are caused by police. And on top of that, police are not investigated. Obviously, the most affected by police violence are Black Brazilians and also people of mixed race that live in poor settings in the cities, but violence has also been moving towards the Amazon and towards the Northeast in the last 15 years. So when Bolsonaro campaigned with those phrases, you started to see cases like the governor of Rio de Janeiro back then, he got into a helicopter and began to shoot literally with a machine gun and two police officers, people in the favelas of Rio, in one of the favelas of Rio. And we have continued to see that type of violence increase as Bolsonaro has sort of given a blank check to police officers. There were some sort of very limited checks on police behavior that some states had been introducing, and with Bolsonaro, those were reversed. There was also this incredible sort of change in legislation for people to be able to buy guns. And so now we have an incredibly armed society. And so what I really worry about is, on top of this sort of violence by the police and also by criminal groups, and on top of, it's not only drug trafficking associations, but for example, in Rio de Janeiro, we now see that the most violent criminal organization are militias that are deeply endorsed by Bolsonaro. The militias are composed of former police officers, prison guards, and they're really a very predatory form of criminal group that elect a lot of representatives to office. And so they have a blank check from the state, and they go to poor communities to extort people, to ask for higher prices for accessing television and basic services that they control. And they kill anyone who is, in between, like, Marieli, who was a local representative, a Black woman who had been fighting against police violence, and she was murdered by the militia. So this type of behavior during Bolsonaro's presidency just began to spread. And on top of that, I'm really worried about the decentralized violence that he has ignited. So today, 2/3 of the population fear that they are going to be victims of violence because of their political preferences. So it means that if you go to the streets and you are dressed in red, the color associated with Lula, you are going to fear being killed in the street or being attacked by Bolsonaro's supporters. And I think this is the main danger that I see. I agree with Fernando that Bolsonaro doesn't have so much institutional support to orchestrate a military coup. We hope so. But I think that it's going to really be very damaging for Brazilian society to have a large percentage of the population who still are going to believe Bolsonaro, that he won the elections, that there is, that there was electoral fraud, similar to what we have observed here in the US. And this is not going to go away soon. And so this is going to be sort of a semi-fascist sort of movement, a decentralized movement that is going to be empowered for some years to come. And that's what I really worry a lot about. We also have to talk about all the violence that Bolsonaro ignited in the Amazons and indigenous peoples, and the sort of support that he has given to all the agribusiness, the loggers, including criminal groups to just expropriate indigenous peoples from their land and burn the Amazons. So you have to listen to Michael Fox's podcast to really understand why Bolsonaro really has put Brazil on fire. And I truly fear that after the elections, he's going to claim, well, if he claims there is fraud against him, we're going to have something similar to what we observe in the US, where there is very limited legitimacy to the institutions. Even when people can observe, as Fernando is saying, I mean, there is all this intention of transparency and saying that, the results are real. It's always, we have observed how these politicians can't really, get into people's minds and say, these are fake news, and so we really won the election. And so this is what I think can really damage democracy in the long run in Brazil. I don't see a military coup, as Fernando has commented, but I see the possibility of a lot of sort of lack of legitimacy of the institutions, and that is by itself a form of embracing violence.
Yeah. So that's so your guess is that this is going to be something that Brazil is going to have to deal with in the long run, just like we're having to deal with semi-fascist movements here in the United States.
Yes, unfortunately. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I hope that part of what we can be doing here with this effort is to connect the democratic movements in the United States and Brazil, because I think not only do we have a lot to talk about, but there's probably a lot that we can do to mutually support each other. So with that, I'd like to do exactly what you suggested, Beatriz, which is to go back to Michael Fox and ask him about the Amazon. I know, Michael, that you're going there as part of our coverage just after the election. What is going on? You have the podcast, Brazil on Fire. Please give us the basics. And also, while you're doing so, tell us what a Lula government might or might not do to change that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that are really important. First off, you remember back in 2019, the fires were exploding. You had big protests all up and down the world. It was so bad. This year, they were even worse. I mean, they've been consecutively worse every single year, but you don't hear anything about it because everybody's so busy doing other stuff. So this year, the fires, the deforestation is the worst it's been in roughly a decade. And all of this goes back to Bolsonaro's gutting of the state institutions, the environment, the indigenous agencies that used to protect those conservation areas. They used to protect the indigenous reserves, and actually would protect indigenous peoples, and particularly under COVID, because basically what happened when COVID went down, they just pulled everybody out. And this was the moment that illegal landowners, illegal loggers, illegal miners, narco traffickers found this moment to, now we're going to take advantage and we're going to move into these communities. Now, these people, to go back, the whole reason why those fires just sparked off during Bolsonaro's first year is because he had been talking about, we want to develop the Amazon. And this harkens back to the dictatorship. We want to, that is our goal. He sees it as a treasure chest. In fact, that's what we talk about in the podcast. And so he wants to open up mining in indigenous communities, and he wants to open up everything. And so the folks that are there, the illegal actors that are there, that want that same thing, they felt empowered in the same way that folks around Brazil, fascist or semi-fascist or racist, felt empowered to then act the way they wanted to act because they saw themselves imaged within Bolsonaro. So that's really when folks started entering into indigenous communities and conservation territories. Invasions of indigenous communities spiked 150% just within the first 3 months of Bolsonaro's government. And so this has only been increasing. You have 20,000 illegal miners just on Yanomami territory alone, which is one indigenous territory in northern Brazil. It's the largest indigenous territory, but we're talking about 20,000 legal miners that are not just kind of doing their own thing over there. They're violent. They've attacked Yanomami communities. They're spreading malaria. They're spreading COVID-19 and all these other vices. So that's kind of the reality on the ground. Now, it's really important to understand the context. Lula, when he came to power, when he came to power back in 2003, deforestation in the Amazon was even worse than it was now. Now, he took a look at that, and together with his environment minister, Marina Silva, and many other people, they enacted several forms of policies and legislation to really attack the deforestation, and they were able to decrease it by half within 2 years. They basically had new mandates on what one could or could not do. They set up tracking systems for meat and wood and just a bunch of other policies that really in fact, Brazil was able to meet its UN 2020 climate change, carbon gas emissions goals early, ahead of schedule, because they were able to decrease the amount of deforestation so much. And all of this was unraveled by Bolsonaro, and then the previous government of Michel Temer started to take the rails off, but under Bolsonaro, it's all been unraveled. So what you can see right now, what will happen if Lula comes to power, he's obviously going to try and roll those things back. He's going to try and move in that direction. Here's the problem. At this point, because of Bolsonaro, how he's unleashed this kind of lawlessness in the Amazon, a lot of people have been talking about, like, in fact, the chief of indigenous community, the Caripuna people, who I mentioned in the podcast, I spoke with him just a couple of days ago, and he said, listen, even if Lula comes to power, I don't know if he can undo. I don't know if he can install the same thing now, because now these illegal groups are even more empowered than ever before, and the lawlessness is there, and they're more organized together with other narco traffickers that are there. So that's the concern. But is he going to try? Yeah, there's no doubt that he's going to try and move back in that direction. And you know, this is the hope, not just for Brazil, but for the entire world, right? So that's what's at stake, and this is the reason why I kind of mentioned at the beginning this idea of democracy and dictatorship. It's about life and destruction, because that's kind of the root of everything that we're seeing in this election right now.
Wow. Well, that's stunning, horrifying, and I see some hope in that. That if the new government can control those forces that have been let loose, and that sounds like quite a challenge. Do you think that there's let me ask you, Fernando, is there a consensus or a constituency in Brazil to back Lula up on those environmental concerns? Is that something that is of concern to Brazilians, just like it is to those of us around the world?
I think everybody's concerned about that subject. You know, one of the important moves by Lula recently was the support of Marina Silva. You know, as you well know her. You know, from the Green Party, the old Green Party. Now she's on the Network Party. But then she committed to the campaign. You know, she said, okay, I'll support you, but then I have my own agenda, you know, environmental agenda, and it has a lot of things that a future Lula's administration should be trying to address, you know. So I think that was a very good sign, and I think a lot of people were very excited about the prospect of having a figure of like Marina Silva, you know, back in Lula's government. That would mean a lot to everybody who supports the Amazon and the environment, you know.
And Beatriz, we're getting close to the end of the hour, and you touched on this earlier, but I'd just like you to reflect one more time on what might be different under a Lula administration in terms of violence and the communities that you have been involved in documenting and defending?
So yeah, I want to emphasize what Fernando said, that Lula really raised millions of people out of poverty. He created very effective social policies, conditional cash transfers, Bolsa Familia, and also there was a very important reform for having people who normally are poor and never get to public universities that are the best in Brazil. So for them to be able to go to university, that had huge impact on poor populations. So most of my work has been with favela residents, and they were telling me really that during the years of Lula, I spent a lot of time in Rio specifically working during the Lula's years, and then with Bolsonaro, I really had to stop because police violence was never going to change during his administration. When I was working with Lula during the Lula administration, obviously it's a federal system, so we cannot, adjudicate this to Lula, but there were significant changes that started to make reduce police violence, control militias, but especially I think that by raising the socioeconomic opportunities for people who are normally excluded and discriminated against, I think that violence necessarily, needs to reduce. And we observed that during the Lula's years. So it is really important to emphasize that the reason that he's so much ahead in the polls is that because people remember, those years. Poor people who are the majority in Brazil still remember how much those policies impacted their lives. So we always said that Lula was the example of a really effective left-wing government in Latin America, because there have been left-wing governments who are actually turned authoritarian, as we know, but Lula really managed to, be with a democratic system and raise people out of poverty. So I'm very hopeful for him to come back and reinstitute the policies that really made a lot of difference for a lot of poor people in Brazil, including people in the Amazons.
I am very grateful to all four of you for all of the thoughts you've shared with me and with our audience today. And I'm looking forward to more coverage with you. There's clearly a lot to be talked about that we didn't get to today. And we'd love to reflect more on, I hope, and I suppose we're not really supposed to show our bias here, but I hope that next week we might be able to talk, more about what a new government could do, what its foreign policy aspects might be, how relationships between the United States and our own communities, our own people-to-people kind of efforts might be useful in supporting mutually the kind of places that both of our societies need to go. I think it's very interesting how many parallels have emerged between what's happening in the United States and what's happening in Brazil. We are really happy to have had this conversation. And Annalie, before we sign off tonight, could you just share again the ways that people who are listening can follow the coverage that Peninsula 360, Global Exchange, Rompeviento, and all of the folks that we're working with are putting out?
Yes, here they are, Ted. And I just wanted to add a little bit on what Michael was saying about what's at stake, not only in terms of environmental struggles, but like Celso Sanchez said from the Uni Rio, and he said that Brazil is not only a very biodiverse country, but socio-diverse. And in this sense, I think what's really at stake also, and we should not forget about that, are the human rights that are really, really in the eye of the hurricane right now. So just wanted to close with that, if that was okay. And please follow us, our social media, and we will be covering every day from now until the end of October, really, and more.
Fabulous. And Anna, could you stop the screen share just so we can say goodbye to each other? And I really want to thank everyone once again. It's been great. This webcast is recorded and will be available. It was streaming live in Mexico on Rompeviento TV, interpreted into Spanish. And we will keep working with you. Thank you so much. And we're looking forward to knowing what's going to happen this weekend. Until then.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, guys.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Beatriz. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Anna Lee.